G'day and welcome to another episode of Ian Smissen's Photography. In this episode I'm going to be trying to get one shot and I'm going to show you how I've gone from planning, preparation, make the shot and then post-processing all in one go. So I'm down here at Ocean Grove Beach, walking distance from home. I normally go further away from home to shoot, but sometimes it's really good to come to a location that you're familiar with and take some shots in a time that you can get here really quickly when you know the conditions are going to be right. And in order to work out those conditions, I've used several websites to plan this trip. So let's have a look at these now. So here's my starting point. I'll always look at Google Maps first. And here's Ocean Grove, the town that I live in, and you can see there's a long strip of beach here that runs all the way from Point Lonsdale up to the Barwon River. And in particular, I'm going to be shooting down in this region where I know, and if I go to satellite view, you can see, I know, and I'll blow these up, that there are these rock pools and rock platforms that get exposed at low tide. So I know that's going to be useful. And if I expand back up here, and if I look out towards the west, I should be able to get sunset appearing along this beach. But I need to know whether I can get to those rocks at around the time of sunset. So let's have a look at the tide predictions. And this is the Bureau of Meteorology in Australia with their tidal prediction site for Point Lonsdale, which is the closest point at which the tides are actually measured. And you can see here that low tide is at 8:12 p.m. at a height of 0.16 metres, which is fairly low. So even though that sunset is going to be earlier than that, and if I switch over to the photographer's ephemeris, this is the web app, but you can also get apps for your phone. They cost a bit of money, but the web app is free. And you can see here, if I'm set to today's date and the location that I'm trying to shoot at, you can see this orange line here is indicating where the sun is going to be setting. So it'll be setting looking along that beach. So I should be able to get a nice little angle across that beach towards the setting sun, and hopefully the clouds in the background here, if they're going to colour up, and I can see the predicted time of sunset is going to be at 6:26 p.m. So there's still over an hour and a half of tide going out, but because it's low enough, there should be enough water movement across those rocks, and it's going to be safe because I know the tide is going out. So I'm not going to get trapped with the tide coming in and surrounding me if I'm working on a rock platform. And the last site that I'm going to look at is one called Cloud Free Night. And this gives you cloud predictions. This is the cloud cover at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, which was about 45 minutes ago. But the best thing about this is that I can add 6 hours to this. And now you can see what the clouds are likely to be like at around the time of sunset. The best thing about this, though, is that I can also switch the views to show how much low cloud there is, in which case there is none, and that's good because that means that there's no cloud going to be sitting right on the horizon blocking out the sun as it's setting. I can then look at middle cloud and high cloud, and you can see there's only a tiny little wispy bit of high cloud, but this middle cloud hopefully is high enough to be lit up by the setting sun as it hits the horizon below the cloud. So this is almost perfect. Of course, that's a 6-hour prediction. What actually happens, we'll have to wait and see when we get down to the beach tonight. So what I'm trying to do is to shoot the sunset, and it's got the perfect sky as I predicted using those websites, where the sun is dropping below that high and mid-level cloud. It's currently about half an hour away from setting, and we've got the bright sunshine looking straight into me, which is just way too bright to try and balance up the foreground rocks, which have got shade on them.
But I'm going to frame up the shot I want and then just wait for that sun to drop down closer to the horizon and maybe beyond the horizon in order to be able to take the shot that I pre-envisaged. So here we go. I think I've got about the framing that I want now. I've got a shot with these rocks here in the foreground, the water washing around them slowly, and if I slow the shutter speed down to about a half a second, 1 second, maybe 2 seconds, I can get some movement around that rock that'll show me water flow in the foreground, with the waves just slightly blurred in the background because they're further away, and then the bright orange sun that's going to sit behind the haze. There's some burn off going on in 2 or 3 spots over the Otways and in Barwon Heads that I'm pointing straight towards, which should give me a really bright orange sunset. I'm not sure how much of that haze is going to break up the light reflecting back up into the clouds, but we'll give it a go. So the first thing I'm going to do is take the camera off the tripod, try some angles a bit lower, a bit higher, move the horizon up and down, move slightly left and right to get the composition I want. And then I'm just going to set up and work out if I need any filtration to slow the shutter speed down, get set up, and then just keep clicking through. Because as the sun is setting, the light changes so quickly, you never know when you've got it exactly right. It can keep getting better and better, or it can just drop off really quickly. So you can't wait for the perfect time. You've got to just keep trying and see what happens. So let's have a go. So this is at standing eye height. If I drop down to about waist level, you'll notice what happens to these rocks in the midground and the foreground. Firstly, they appear to get further away, and then secondly, I lose the separation between them, and what I want is to show is that water flow around this rock in the foreground. I also might zoom in a little bit, not too much, because I want to keep the water around that rock on the left-hand side, and that looks like about the right framing. So now I'm just going to set up, get some filters on, and have a go. All right, it's starting to really pink up now that the sun has dropped below the horizon. I think that's going to change very quickly. So I'm ready to shoot here. I've got the framing up. I've moved a little bit closer. I've dropped the camera down a little bit. I can still get separation here. I'll take this shot now because the color is still really nice. Now I need one wave to wash in here on a slow exposure to get that blurred movement in the foreground. And here one comes. We'll just have to wait and see. Okay, it's washed in forwards. I would rather get the backwash because that tends to give a more pleasant view. So I'll just have to wait a couple more seconds to get this movement. And expose for the foreground.
So let's have a look at the images back on the computer and process the one we like. And here's the image that I've chosen. I chose this one because it has the full dynamic range without clipping the highlights, so it gives me enough detail in here to manipulate the image to what I want. It also has, with a 5-second exposure, a nice blur in the water in the foreground and these nice ripples across the sand in the midground. So first of all, I'll do my standard lens correction just to remove chromatic aberration and enable the profile corrections. And because I'm using the Panasonic G9, it automatically builds in the profile for the lens and the camera. The next thing that I do is to go to the basic panel, and I want to pull back these highlights, and I'll just pull that back until I'm satisfied. And in fact, I think at about 90% is going to be okay. Then I want to push the shadows a fair way up because I want more detail in these foreground and midground rocks. So I'll push the shadows up until I've got enough detail in those without getting too much. And I think about there. The whites, I just want to push just a little bit to get more of the bright sun in there. So I'm going to push that up to about here. I don't want to push it so that it looks unnatural. Because this beautiful hazy sky, I don't want to have a bright white blob in the middle there. The blacks are fine, but what I would try and do here is just push these up until, I'll just keep going. There, you'll notice here, up here, the blacks have dropped out to magenta, which means that not all of the colours are fully underexposed or fully black there. So I'll push it back to there, where I do have some pure blacks, but not much. I'm not going to use any texture because I've got enough texture in here and I don't want to add extra noise and texture to the sky, but I will add a little bit of clarity, which just gives me just that little bit more detail in the rocks here. And I'm going to push the vibrance up to bring the color back, remembering that a raw file loses the saturation and the color in it. So I'm going to push that up to about there. That gives me enough of this beautiful orange-pink light back again. But I also want to push the color temperature because in the field when I was there, this is much more orange than the sort of magenta tone that I see in this raw file. So I'm going to push the color temperature up to about there and add just a little bit of tint. So that's more like the color that I was seeing in the field. The next thing I usually do is to go to the Details tab and sharpen this up just a little bit, go to about 70. And if I hold down the Alt key and push the masking up, you can see here that what is in white is what's actually being sharpened. I don't want to sharpen the sky too much, but I do want to sharpen the edges, particularly in the bottom half. So that looks pretty good. I'm not going to change noise reduction because I'll deal with that somewhere else. And the last thing I want to do is go to the tone curve, and I'm just going to push these midtones just up a few percent because I want to lighten the image a little bit, and I can darken the edges and things down later with a vignette. So that's pretty good for the global settings. I do want to make a couple of local changes though. Firstly, I want to darken down the sky because it's just a little bit too bright, but I don't want to darken the foreground anymore. So I'm going to put a graduated filter over the sky, and I also want to push the color up just a little bit. So I'm going to add some color temperature, add some yellows to it, and push the magenta up just a little bit. I'm then going to pull the highlights down. I don't want to just do a full darkening. I want to darken the highlights a little bit. That looks pretty good. And push the shadows up a little bit too, to add more intensity to these midtones up here. And the magic tool for skies is dehaze. So if I push the dehaze up to about here, you can see that that's increased the contrast between the lighter and the darker parts in these clouds and really brought out some of the detail in those clouds. I'm also going to reduce the noise completely out of the sky. I don't mind having the detail in the sandy areas here because it gives me a little bit of grain in the sand, but I don't want noise up in the sky. In addition to that though, I want to bring out a little bit more detail in these rocks. So the way I'm going to do that is to use a brush tool, and I'm going to just brush across this top part of this foreground rock to start with. I'm going to push the exposure up just a little bit, about 1/3 of a stop, to increase the lights in here. I also want to change the color of it. It's a little bit white and a little bit bland, so add a little bit of color temperature and a little bit of magenta tint. And I want to lighten up these rocks in the midground and underneath this foreground rock. So I'm going to create a new brush under here so I can see what that is going to look like. and push the exposure up just about a third of a stop. And again, because I'm pushing the exposure up on really dark parts, that's getting a little bit noisy, so I want to pull the noise out of that as well. And I think I can afford to push the exposure up a little bit more, so that looks pretty good. And if I just reduce the size of this brush and do the same things over here, just to bring a little bit more detail out in the dark rocks. I still want the contrast of the dark against light, but I don't want it just to be a big black blob. Right, I think that's pretty good as a starting point. The next things that I'm going to do are going to be in Photoshop. So if I click on Edit in Photoshop and wait for that to load. Right, here we are in Photoshop. So first thing I want to do is to make a copy of this layer, because I don't want to work on the background layer in case I screw things up. I would rather make a copy of that layer and then work on it. So first thing I want to do is to get rid of some of these distractions around the edge, and there's a couple of little hotspot highlights that I don't like. They're a distraction to the eye as well. So I already have the spot healing tool chosen, and so I'm just going to go over these and get rid of some of these distracting parts around the edge. It's always worth doing this in the field, but sometimes you just can't help getting distractions in here. And go over that. And this little bright patch here I don't like. So that's going to do for that. The next thing I'm going to do is to, if I make a copy of that layer, again, trying to do non-destructive changes. I don't want to have to reverse the whole lot and start again, so I continually make new layers when I'm doing new changes. So next thing I'm going to do is to go to the Nik Collection Color Effects Pro, because their Pro Contrast tool has a really great filter in it called Dynamic Contrast. And if I just choose Pro Contrast and push this Dynamic Contrast up, you can see what it does. It pushes the midtones that are slightly lighter than middle to be lighter, and the midtones that are slightly darker to be darker. So if I push that contrast up to about there, I think that looks pretty good. And if I turn that on and off, you can just see the subtle changes that have been made in there. I'm going to add a brilliance and warmth filter, and I'm going to push this up just a little bit, about 12 or 13%, which will just add a little bit more warmth to it. And I'm going to add one more filter, a skylight filter, and the default is at 20%, which is just way too strong. It's over the top. But if I pull that back to about 5%, and if I turn that on and off, you can see there's just a subtle change. You may not be able to see it on the video, but there's just a subtle change to the brightness of these mid-tone colors. So that's all I need to do for that. Wait for that to finish and make another layer. Filter MacFun Creative Kit Noiseless, and this is my favorite noise reduction tool, mostly because it has some really useful presets in it. And if I scroll up, even though I pulled the noise out of the sky when I was in Lightroom, you can see some of the other adjustments that I've made have added a little bit more noise. But if I just click on the lightest adjustment here, and you can see on the right hand side, if I just move this side to side, what that does, the effect that that has, and it's just exactly what I want. I don't want to remove too much detail in these color patterns, but I just want to get this little bit of grain out of the sky. So if I click apply, wait for that to finish, and that's worked well, but it's taken a little bit of the grain out of the sand down on the bottom here. So I'm going to put a mask over that. So if I just come down here and click on the add layer mask and move over to the side and choose the gradient tool, and I just want to block out You can see here now that mask, I've blocked out the bottom 40%. So where all of the detail is in here, I'm retaining that detail, and I've taken the noise out of the sky. All right, the last thing I want to do on a new layer, well, second last thing, is to try an Orton effect. Now the Orton effect just adds a little bit of glow, and there's multiple ways of doing that, but my favorite is to go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, blur at a radius of about 20 pixels, and then switch this over to either overlay or soft light. Now overlay is just too much, so we'll try soft light, but even that is way too much. But if we pull the opacity down to about 15 to 20%, and if I turn this layer on and off, you can see there's just a subtle glow in the sky in the highlights. So it just increases the contrast a little bit without making it too crunchy. And then last, I want to do a quick sharpening, and my favorite sharpening tool is the high pass filter. Radius of 3 pixels, and then choose either overlay or soft light. Soft light is usually a bit more subtle, and I think that is ready to go. So now it's a matter of save that, which will save it back to Lightroom, and then do the final adjustments in Lightroom. Now we're back in Lightroom. The last thing for me to do is to add a vignette. So I go to the effects panel, pull the vignette right back. I usually pull it back to about 50% or more as a starting point, just so that I can see where the effect is taking place. Pull the midpoint back to usually somewhere around 0 to 10. Push the feather all the way back out to 100. And that looks pretty good. And then I just adjust the amount back so that it's a subtle effect, but enough to draw my attention to the center of the image. So there's my final image. Hope you like it.
So if you like this video, please subscribe, click like, click the bell, do all those things, tell your friends, but most importantly, remember pixels are free, so get out there and shoot more. Who can beat it? A beautiful sunset, low tide on the beach. Fantastic. See you next time.